Alright, this is a video that is quite far from the usual on this channel, but it's a request from one of our patrons who recently moved to Romania and wants to start understanding the basics, and we do our best to please our patrons wherever possible. Anyway, although the topic is a bit unusual for the channel, I'll try my best to make it interesting, so with that said, let's dive in. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. So, for the purposes of this video, we'll be looking into the following topics: the system of governance in Romania, recent political history, political parties and elections, mythology and reality about corruption, influence and prevalence of degenerate ideas, and what to expect in the near future. So, when it comes to the system of governance, it's modeled more or less by the French system, with some tinkering here and there to fit the local political practice developed over time. The system of governance has been described most of the time as a semi-presidential republic, or less often a semi-parliamentary republic. This is because the president has more powers than the president of, let's say, Hungary, which is a parliamentary republic, but fewer powers than the president of France, which is a full-fledged presidential republic. The governance is ensured by three separate powers: the legislative power, vested into the two chambers of the parliament, the deputies chamber and the senate, and the executive power, vested in the government, and the judicial power, vested in the courts. Now, over these three, there is the president who, as I said, has more power than in a parliamentary republic, and the president's power is regulated by the constitution, and when the constitution is unclear, the constitutional court intervenes. Now, the Constitutional Court acts in practice very similarly to the Supreme Court of the United States, although this is not an absolute rule. If a case doesn't have constitutional implications, the Supreme Court in those cases is the High Court of Cassation and Justice, which is identical to the French and Italian system, where there is a Constitutional Court and a Court of Cassation, Cour de Cassation in France and Corte di Cassazione in Italy. The president is elected by popular vote for a 5-year term. Now, it used to be 4 years until 2004, but the constitution was amended in 2003 to extend the president's term. Now, someone cannot serve as president more than 2 terms. Under these rules, there have been 2 presidents who served 2 terms: the socialist Ion Iliescu between 1992 and 1996 and 2000 to 2004, and the populist rightist Traian Băsescu between 2004 and 2014. The current president is the national liberal Klaus Iohannis, elected in 2014 after narrowly defeating the socialist Victor Ponta in the second round in November 2014. The parliament, as I was saying, has 2 chambers, the deputies chamber and the senate. Both chambers of the parliament are elected by popular vote, unlike France, where the senate is elected by an electoral college. Now, the previous parliament was elected in a multiple-seat individual constituencies. That is to say, individuals would campaign in the previously drawn constituency, and then under an algorithm that I won't bother to explain, it was perfectly possible for 2, and in very, very few cases even 3 individuals to end up gaining a seat for that constituency. The current parliament, elected in December 2016, was elected using the proportional representation list-based system, and the constituencies coincided with the administrative counties. The method to award the seats was used for this parliament, and really all parliaments since 1992, except the one elected in 2012, as I was saying, is called the D'Hondt method, used in most of Europe. Now, I personally dislike this particular method, but it appears to be the most popular method these days. Now, the reason I don't like it is because it's not appropriate, in my view, for big countries. In Europe, this system is used by small countries, except Ireland, Malta, Norway, and Sweden, and among the countries with 20 million or more inhabitants, only Spain, Poland, and Romania uses it. France, Germany, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, except Wales, and Italy use the different system, and in my opinion, better. Now, the current parliament has 328 deputies and 136 senators representing 41 administrative regions or counties, plus the capital city, plus another special region for diaspora, so 43 in total. The number of representatives a country is allotted depends on the population. So, for instance, the Iași county is represented by 12 deputies and 5 senators, whereas Călărași county is represented by only 4 deputies and 2 senators. Alright, let's look at the courts a bit more. The courts are hierarchical and follow the Roman model of the so-called civil law. Now, what this means in practice is that if a decision is made in, let's say, the Cluj Court of Appeal, is not precedent-setting in the sense of changing the law. Now, this means there is little incentive for activist judges to do stupid things. And that doesn't mean stupid things don't happen, but the incentives are much smaller. The incentive is further eroded by the fact that in most cases there's always a superior court to appeal a decision, and also one can require to move the trial somewhere else. This is particularly true in civil cases or the non-felony cases. So, for instance, if someone sues me for libel in a Cluj-Napoca court, I can require, and it's almost always granted if you know what you're doing, to have the trial moved to Timișoara, for instance. Now, this is a good thing in practice because judges tend to follow slightly different traditions depending on the region. The judges in Cluj tend to be more moderate, whereas those in Timișoara tend to be more free speech fundamentalists. So in a libel trial, it's better to have the trial there. The only place where there is room for activist judges is the Constitutional Court, but so far this hasn't happened in overt fashion. One of the latest tests on this happened in July 2016, when the Constitutional Court unanimously decided that the referendum to amend the Constitution to define marriage as between a man and a woman can take place, as it doesn't breach the Constitution or human rights in general. Now, this is a normal decision, but in these abnormal, militant leftist times, one would be forgiven if thinking something else could have come out from there. It didn't, and that's great. Alright, enough with this, let's get to the recent political history. Now, over the last 13 years, there were two big political conflicts which are still going on to this day. The first was whether the National Anti-Corruption Directorate should be given more power or less power, and the second on whether the state should become smaller or not. Traditionally, the right has been for giving more power to the National Anti-Corruption Directorate and for shrinking the state. Now, I'll address the corruption part separately, so let's focus on economics a bit. As you can see, the social issues weren't really at the forefront of the debate until very, very recently, and this is partly because most of the obvious problems inherited from communism were sorted in late 1990s and early 2000s. Now, of course, what I just said here is triggering for progressives, but I don't really care what progressives think. But really, one of the reasons this was the case is because you have a very solid, socially conservative majority society. Anyway, since 2004, when Traian Băsescu was elected alongside with a majority in the parliament for his political party, well, actually it wasn't an alliance, but anyway, there was a consistent push to get the state out of the way from certain sectors. Now, one of his first speeches was about how the populace needs to learn to rely less on the state and more on itself for prosperity to rise. Now, in practice, this meant first and foremost a tax reform, most of which is still holding up to this day. The landmark of that period is the 16% flat tax, which replaced the old bureaucratic and complex progressive taxation system. This also meant a push for more privatization and, since 2009, a push for less spending. Now, the economic crisis overall was a good thing. It pushed the government to enact economically liberal measures. The labor code was liberalized to make hiring and firing easier, labor regulations were cut back, mostly kicking and screaming because the entrenched bureaucratic interests utterly hated it, and hiring in the state sector was largely frozen, at least for a while. Now, in addition to that, the wages of state workers were cut back by 25%, a measure which, in my opinion, I think it didn't go far enough. The cuts should have been deeper. Basically, between 2004 and 2012, there was a serious period of draining the swamp. Now, the bad news is that the process wasn't popular. The cuts in the state workers' wages were heavily protested, mostly unsuccessful at the time, and it all culminated with the second suspension of the president. Oh yeah, about that. I forgot to mention. The parliament can suspend the president, provided that the constitutional court agrees, and if that happens, within 30 days a referendum is organized and the populace has to either confirm the parliament's decision, in which case a snap presidential election is organized, or reject the parliament's decision and reconfirm the president. Now, Băsescu got through this twice. Once in 2007, when he was suspended for allegedly breaking the constitution and the population voted with a 3-1 majority to reinstate him, and in 2012. Now, in 2012, his popularity wasn't that big because he had pushed for draining the swamp, as I was saying. However, under the rules of that time, 50% plus 1 of the electorate had to come to vote in order for the referendum to be valid. Otherwise, the referendum would be null and the suspended president would go back to, well, to being president. Now, his fans at that time, most of them anyway, stayed home intentionally in the day of the referendum, and thus the turnout was only 46%, not enough to make the referendum valid. Anyway, this failed suspension attempt and the impeachment attempt did create a rallying cry on the left, which led the Social Democratic Coalition to win the 2012 parliamentary elections under the banner The Social Liberal Union, which got almost 60% of the votes, crushing the right-wing alliance, which only got 16.5% of the votes. Now, since 2012, there was a constant push to undrain the swamp. Now, the good news is that it wasn't quite successful. The bad news is that the mainstream right hasn't recovered. Now, there are many reasons for this. Chief among them is that the coalition was held together by Traian Băsescu's popularity. When that faded away, there was no decent leader to replace him. Long story, and quite boring, let's be honest, for most people who might end up watching this. Alright, let's move forward further to political parties and elections. Now, when it comes to political parties, Romania really does resemble France. When it comes to turnouts, at least on paper, Romania resembles the United States. Let me explain. Just like in France, the mainstream left is solidly represented by the same political party, the Social Democratic Party. Just like in France, and Italy for that matter, the mainstream right is running under a different banner almost every election because of the never-ending internal bickering, plus the usual partisan hackery, subversion, and of course, plain old stupidity. Now, the mainstream left has those too, but their communist tradition allows the party leaders to stamp out these things and keep the umbrella united. In any event, the political parties that can always expect to be in the next parliament are the Social Democratic Party, the PSD, the National Liberal Party, the PNL, and the Democratic Union of Hungarians in Romania, or the UDMR, or the RDMSZ, whatever. Besides these, there is always at least one other leftist party and one other rightist party alongside with a new political party. This is usually the case. In the past, the second leftist party was the Conservative Party, formerly the Humanist Party, conservative in the Russian sense, that is to say, fighting to conserve communism. The founder, Dan Voiculescu, founded the CNN affiliate in this country and is currently serving a 10 years jail sentence for money laundering. I mean, what a shock. The CNN affiliate is led by a communist thief. Very shocking indeed. Well, at least we put them in jail here. Also, in the past, until 2004, there was another political party that could always expect to get between 5.5 and 8% at the polls, the Greater Romania Party, which was basically a National Socialist Party led by the poet and former journalist Corneliu Vadim Tudor, a very colorful individual to say the least. In the current parliament, besides the traditional PSD, PNL, and UDMR, there also resides a newly formed party called the Save Romania Union, the USR, and the populist movement party, the PMP, led by former President Traian Băsescu. Now, personal opinion, PMP is the closest to my own values. Strong borders, economic liberalism, freedom of speech, strong military, patriotism, low regulations, and so on and so forth. Their problem, however, is the people. They have too many low-quality and low-energy people in the party. The USR is basically a soup. It's a political party created less than 6 months before the elections from various local civic and militant groups for various causes, some of them sound, but most of them completely bonkers. Their main promise was that they would do a different kind of politics, a slogan reasserted to me by one of their MPs whom I interviewed for their Romanian language channel. Now, I don't hold this party in much regard at all. In fact, I think they are far worse than the Social Democrats because they have far more radical leftists in the party. Now, their carrot is that they also have a few hardline libertarians, but as we say here, one swallow doesn't make a summer. Besides these parties, there are also smaller factions of 1 to 3 members representing the various ethnic minorities in the countries, except Hungarians, who, as I said, they have their own party. These factions are like, the Union of Italians in Romania, the Unions of Polish in Romania, the Union of Armenians in Romania, and so on and so forth. Alright. Now let's say a few things about election and election turnouts. Now, election turnouts have become increasingly hard to calculate even as election fraud has been curbed to non-existent. The reason this is the case is because voter registration is done by the government for the electorate. In other words, the government compiles the lists, not the voters registering themselves, as it's the case in the United States. Inherent governmental inefficiency led to multiple cases of dead people included in the lists or people who haven't stepped foot in this country in over a decade. In the last elections in December 2016, there were almost 18.3 million people registered on governmental lists registered to vote. Now, this number cannot possibly be true because it would mean that the people ineligible to vote number only 1.3 million in this country. Now, in addition to children, certain criminals are also banned from voting in this country, as well as people diagnosed with certain mental disorders. Now, there are at least 3.7 million children in schools and state kindergartens. The total number of children is at least 4.2 million, conservatively speaking. So either the population of Romania is close to 23 million inhabitants and the 2011 census is very, very wrong, or the election lists based on which the turnout is calculated are wrong. Now, the latter is much more likely. A census can be wrong by 50 or maybe even 100,000 people, but a census to somehow miss out 4 to 5 million people, and that's simply not possible. Which is why I'm not buying the turnout numbers. Officially, the last parliamentary elections had a turnout of 39.48% with 7,211,776 ballots cast here in this country, plus 103,656 ballots cast abroad. I definitely do buy the number of votes, but the turnout is calculated on a wrong total. The actual turnout is more like 50-52%. Traditionally, the turnout is higher in presidential elections and local elections, whilst referenda and parliamentary elections get lower turnouts. Alright, now let's dwell a bit on corruption. But not too much, because this video is already getting too long. Anyway, the issue of corruption, and this is true in all countries, is perception dependent. That is to say, the real level of corruption is usually irrelevant in a discussion about corruption. What matters more, sadly, is how much corruption people feel there is. For instance, when the United Kingdom started investigating the issue of MPs spending public funds abusively, the UK dropped 10 spots in the Global Corruption Index. When Ireland started investigating possible payments by certain businessmen to government officials, the country dropped over 25 spots in the global index, ending up beneath Uruguay and Bahamas. Now, does anyone seriously believe that Ireland is more corrupt than Bahamas? Well, no, not really. But perception is everything. Basically, a country is better off if it doesn't tackle corruption. Romania, for instance, was ranked much better in 2003 than it ranks now, even though in reality the country is significantly less corrupt today than it was in 2003. Once you start speaking about it, you lose points, and the narrative is created and it has its own snowball effect. There are also two types of corruption, the one that the bien-pensants think it's unacceptable and the one that is acceptable. Corruption is part and parcel of having a much too powerful government. The smaller the government, the smaller the corruption levels. That's why the anti-corruption efforts in mid-2000s in Romania had much more lasting effects than what is happening now, because the cause of corruption had been eliminated then, whereas now there's only bureaucratic gobbledygook. For example, the former general mayor of Bucharest, Sorin Oprescu, was arrested in 2015 for allegedly receiving a bribe of 25,000 euros in cash after being turned in by one of his associates. The trial is still ongoing, though one of his associates was already sentenced a few months ago to 4 years in jail. Now this is corruption. Meanwhile, hundreds of mayors across Europe, including German, Dutch, Danish, and of course Romanian mayors, siphon tens of billions of euros in green projects which effectively enrich the families and friends of the mayors who allegedly provide green energy. Now, this is not corruption because it has the seal of approval of the European Commission. As far as I'm concerned, I would rather let Sorin Oprescu walk free and jail all of these leeches. From a taxpayer perspective, the damage is much higher from legal corruption than from petty bribes. On top of this, the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, praised a while ago by the New York Times, a former newspaper, is starting to lose its popularity. Not because it didn't have results, it absolutely did, but because, like many other government enterprises, it became inefficient and, ironically but also expectedly, susceptible to its own corruption. At this point in time, there is a huge paradox. The locals estimate the level of corruption much higher than it actually is, whereas the immigrants estimate the level of corruption a lot closer to what it is. The only place where corruption hasn't decreased much is the state healthcare system. And quite frankly, I don't think it will ever happen without privatization. As long as it's state-run, corruption will always be there. Doctors will always have an incentive to rank cases based on the bribes they receive because shortages are part and parcel of having a state-run healthcare system. This is true again everywhere, not just here. The market, though, is slowly solving this as more and more people run away from the state healthcare system and move into private plans. Hopefully the whole thing will collapse under its own weight, and thus the collapse will collapse its corruption along with it. Alright. Let's move to the fifth point, influence and prevalence of degenerate ideas. Now, as a rule, degenerate ideas have a very low prevalence in Romania. Just like everywhere else, the prevalence is higher in the big cities and lower, or rather, next to non-existent, in smaller towns and in villages. Now, there used to be a strong gay lobby 20 years ago, but that was a time when it kinda actually mattered. Gay relationships were still criminalized under the communist-era Article 200 of the Criminal Code, so the gay lobby had a legitimate point to exist. Now, by 2014, the gay lobby became already quite irrelevant because it was starting to slowly fade into obscurity. Now, why? Well, because their demands had already been solved. Article 200 was abolished by 2004. It was actually abolished in 2001. Funding for the sufferers of HIV and AIDS was provided, an issue which affects non-straights disproportionately, and the freedom of association was extended in full to gay groups. This resulted in a radical shrinking of their organization, since most gay folks here are actually, believe it or not, conservative. So after they got their legitimate things they demanded, they left the various organizations, and now the gay lobby is a minuscule NGO led by bitter, mean lesbians whom nobody gives a damn about. Now, I routinely joke in my regular AVFM podcast that there are about 80 progressives in Romania, but that joke isn't really far from the truth. Now, outside the National School of Political Science and Administration, the CNSPA, which is essentially the ideological heir of the former Ștefan Gheorghiu Academy, which used to school communists for the Communist Party. Anyway, outside there and outside a few smaller university departments, there are no legit progressives worth mentioning. Their influence is also rather minuscule. During the migrant crisis, they tried to organize a pro-open borders protest. Nobody showed up. Even among the press, even the most left-wing journalists still don't come out overtly as pro-open borders, because they've learned the lessons since the mega mosque debate, a debate which the progressives lost humiliatingly. There are no more than 4 progressives in the parliament, lower than in the previous parliament when there were 6. The independent progressive candidate, Remus Cernea, by far the most progressive politician, a guy who would make Brianna Wu blush in cuckoldry. Anyway, this guy tried to get re-elected in a Bucharest constituency. Not only did he fail, but failed spectacularly. Same goes with other disorders, such as feminism. Finding a real-life, flesh-and-blood, honest-to-God feminist in this country requires hard work, unless you go to CNSPA in Bucharest, where you can find about half a dozen of them. Romanian language feminist pages are now mostly followed by conservatives seeking to mock them, which is why the page Feminism Romania on Facebook now mostly posts things in English, because at least that way they can maintain some online relevance. The only danger is the so-called National Council for Combating Discrimination, or the CNCD, which is an institution that should indeed be dismantled and thrown into the dustbin of history, but even there, they rarely show up, although when they do, they almost always do something stupid. Basically, in this department, what is really needed now is strong defense of the social status quo, because the status quo is very satisfactory most of the time, and in institutional terms, we just need to keep the deep state as it is now and reinforce it with fresh conservative blood. Alright. Last but not least, predictions for the near future. Now, honestly, I think more of the same is to be expected in the next 5 or 6 years. The Social Democrats will try to pass some more insane policies. They will succeed in a third, up to half of them, and lose in another half of them. The government will try some dubious shenanigans that will be protested, again, some of them successfully, some of them not so much. And that's pretty much it. I mean, barring some serious external event, like a new stock market crash, a Russian invasion, or things like that, I find it very, very hard to believe anything very radical would change. And mind you, I don't think that's bad news. Quite the opposite. Radical changes and revolutions are a dangerous business, and the chances of getting it wrong are quite high, especially after the initial outburst. Case in point, the 1989 revolution. We got the first part right, the abolition of the communist regime, but we got the continuation really wrong. Our friends and allies in Poland got the Balcerowicz plan. We got Ion Iliescu. We're still paying for that mistake, thank you, bloody socialists. Anyway, Iliescu's post-1992 constant brakes applied to the economy prolonged the transition needlessly and harmed a generation. That's why I'm not so keen on revolutions. Most of the times, these things go bad. On a more longer term, some tension is to be expected. Left-wing academics are complaining that they have the most conservative generation of students since the 1990s, and I think they're right. Which is why I'm working these days on slowly building up a network of mostly young people based on capitalism, liberty, privacy, and property, with a view for it to become something big 10 to 15 years from now. I fully do expect that to happen by that time. The context will be much more tensed, but also much more ripe for a shift even further rightwards. But strictly on mainstream traditional politics, I don't expect anything other than more of the same until 2020, 2021, and even slightly beyond. Alright. I think that's enough. I hope this does answer the questions of our patron and offers a decent inside view. Generally, I avoid making videos in English about Romania unless something relevant happens, because I already have a channel in Romanian on which I make regular podcasts and interviews. This is for those who will rush to comment and complain that I didn't include that and this and that and XYZ. Yeah, the video is already too long, so adjustments needed to be made. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.